inclusive framework for transition. Let me assure you that they have heard about that, and ad nauseum. The tragedy, in my view, is deeper than that. The two blocs who have been in power so far do not seem convinced that such a framework is possible or even necessary. They are not interested in seeking it or in investing in building it. Some are convinced of the opposite, that this is a zero-sum game and that such a framework would be detrimental to their interests. Both blocs, which have been in power, are still trapped in the old thinking. It's kind of an Orientalist assumption that authoritarianism is necessary to run this political arena. For different reasons and with different objectives, both are convinced that the way to govern this polity is by seeking good objectives, kind of public interest objectives, and ensuring support by the majority. Once you have both, you don't need to worry about political rivals. These political rivals are seen as marginal, political agitators, driven by self-interest and greed, and disconnected from the grievances, the real grievances of Egyptian masses, the Fallaheen and other poor who suffer in the countryside and slums in order to win their bread, and who are totally uninterested in these political machinations. I think a large number of leaders in both the state establishment and the Islamist bloc can use these exact words. There must be dissenting voices in those two camps, but so far the leadership has been of this view. Incidentally, those are almost exactly the same words that Lord Cromer, the notorious colonial high commissioner in Egypt in the end of the 19th century, had used. God bless Edward Said, must be rolling his eyes over there. The third bloc, who has not been in power and who seems, at least for now, interested in building such a framework for the transition, has simply been incapable of getting the other two blocs to embrace it. Doing this requires a clear vision, power, and political skill in order to convince the other blocs. Some of these three elements were available during the last years, but not all of them, or not all of them at the same time. The Democratic bloc proved to be too disorganized and confused to steer the political power it has unleashed. The result is that they managed to be exploited by their competitors almost at every turn of the transition. But the absence of a truly democratic set of agreed ground rules for the political conflict doesn't mean necessarily that authoritarianism can prevail. The success of authoritarianism requires not only the ability and preparedness to use violence, for there isn't a shortage in that, but it has to practically annihilate the ability of the other two blocs to oppose it while maintaining consent of the general public. Is this achievable? Can we dry out the rain and go back to life under drought? Or would attempts at restoring authoritarian rule backfire, leading us to more mudslides? And is there a reason to hope for walking out of the mud into fresh air and sun and proper management of the rain? Scene 2. Why we will get out of the mud. I argue that we will stay in the mud, actually, for some time. Most likely we'll dig deeper in it, but that we will eventually leave it behind to a proper modern democracy. But as I said at the beginning, I don't have psychic powers, and I don't believe anything is predetermined. So my argument is that this is a likely scenario. Let me explain how. Many of my colleagues, and I can see some of them in the room, have good reasons for pessimism. They argue that we are going back to a full-fledged authoritarianism and point to a number of indicators as supporting evidence. Let me go through those. One, they argue, the Egyptian state systems, political, administrative, regulative, economic, and social, are built around authoritarian rule. Egypt is an entrenched corporatist state, and falling back to old habits is the easiest way out for everyone, including the public, especially when under duress. Two, all political players seem immersed in this pattern of governance, and even when the so-called liberals are in position of authority, they act similarly to their supposedly non-democratic rivals. And the new forces are too weak and disorganized to matter, so either they adapt to existing pattern or they end up marginalized. More pessimism. Three, economic and social challenges are huge. Half of the Egyptian population is under poverty line. State institutions are struggling to function. Any democratically elected force would be in a catch-22. It can't afford the social and political cost of necessary economic change, and it can't afford to ignore economic change. Only authoritarian regimes, they say, can survive this economic challenge. Four, repression almost always works, especially if administered wisely. And this country has a long tradition of this kind of wisdom. Fifth, if authoritarianism falters, the alternative would be more mudslides, mainly because no other bloc is capable of running the state machinery and face the current challenges of governance. Most of the players, both inside and outside Egypt, prefer to avoid that, and this will make them more tolerant of authoritarianism. I'm not looking at the EU ambassadors or anything. Those are good arguments, no doubt about it. But are they all of the story or just a part of it? It's now common in social science to point out that the way we represent an issue, the way we frame it, shapes to a large extent the outcome of our analysis. And let me then ask a basic question about framing and about representation. How do we see what took place in Egypt in January 2011 and subsequent events? How do we represent these events? What meaning do we give them? I'm clearly and deliberately moving away now from the consensus area into controversy. Was this a popular uprising, a power contest, or a revolution? And how did it happen exactly? What led to it? And we need to be careful about answering these questions because our answers will shape the predictions of what lies ahead. If your answer is that these events were part of a power contest between the Brotherhood and the state establishment, then the issues become simpler. The question would be whether one crushes the other or whether they reach a compromise. If you think what happened, if your answer is this was a popular uprising, stirred or spontaneous, then the question also becomes simpler. Whether the authorities can contain and absorb the popular discontent and move on or not. Let me advance a third representation, that what we witnessed is part of a deep and comprehensive transformation of Egyptian society and its relation with the state and the world. In other words, that this is a social revolution, unfolding, sometimes quietly, other times in explosions. What we have been seeing are tips of an iceberg. Underneath the daily events, strong currents continue to push for change and will in time, transform the Egyptian political landscape altogether. This is not an objectivist discourse about reality. I am not claiming that this is what is really happening in Egypt. What I am claiming, what I am simply pointing to, is a possible reading of reality, one that raises different questions, one that draws our attention to other dynamics deserving attention, and could possibly modify our understanding of the Egyptian transition. So all I'm asking you at this point is to humor me for another 10 minutes maximum and try to imagine what the future would look like if my suggested reading has any merit. This deeper revolution has obviously complex layers and dynamics, and I would like to focus on two. One is what I shall call a new social paradigm. The Egyptian population has changed over the last 3 decades, and considerably. But because its ruling elite, in the broad sense, have remained the same, this change passed mostly unnoticed. Former President Mubarak was 50 years old when he became president in 1981. He continued to govern with the same group of people until his overthrowing in 2011. Today, 75% of those who have the right to vote are under the age of 50. 75%. We're not counting those who are under 18. Those who are in the electoral body. Those who rule Egypt in the broad sense, not just politically, but also culture, economically, and so on, belong to less than 10% of the population, mainly above 64. They were born between 1925 and 1950, when Egypt was part of the British Empire. Their formative years were the 1950s, or at the latest, the 1960s. They were in power in the 1970s, 2 decades at least before the Soviet Union collapsed. The cognitive world of those who ruled Egypt is a world that no longer exists. And if it is difficult for ordinary people to cope with fundamental changes, imagine how difficult it is for those in power to do that. By contrast, the 2 generations who now form 75% of the electoral body were born between 1964 and 1996. Despite their different ideological and sociological backgrounds, they belong to a different world. Their expectations from the world are different. They're probably the dream coming true of post-colonial scholars. They see themselves as an equal part of the world, entitled to the same rights and expecting those rights to be attained. As far as modernity is concerned, Anthony Giddens would be thrilled, these new generations seem to have less issues with modernity than their predecessors. 1, they display a clear sense of individualism and an emphasis on freedom and equality. 2, they value rationality and pragmatism. 3, they're not fighting them. 3, they expect state and social institutions to be self-reflexive, to be self-monitoring and self-correcting. 4, they show skepticism towards grand narratives and are more comfortable with relativism. 5, and a good part of their social interaction is now disembedded from immediate and local context and spread around distant time and space. Social media is an example of that. They want Egypt to function as a modern state with rule of law, representative government, checks and balances, effective governance, and so on. And their attitude towards authority is to question it, monitor its performance, and expect it to serve public interest. People sharing this paradigm are not necessarily under 50. And not everyone who's under 50 shares this paradigm, but you will find more of them in this category. And this paradigm is not a political ideology, it's broader than this. It's a way of seeing the self, the other, and the world. Now, I'm not aware of rigorous research done to measure the depth or breadth of this social change. I hope some of my colleagues in the sociology and history departments could get interested and probably work with us politicos on that. But if you have been involved in politics recently, or at least if you have been listening to people across Egypt, you would probably agree with me that this paradigm is widespread and expanding. You can detect its elements in secular and Islamist positions and discourses. And you will certainly find its adherents in rural areas as well as in cities and in various social classes. This is the new Egypt. This is the new majority that is sick and tired of the old Egypt. And it has been looking for ways underneath the surface to push the old Egypt out, both inside and outside government. I published this morning an article in an Egyptian newspaper about what has changed in Egypt. One of the readers left a comment because also readers today do not accept authority of authors, and they almost feel compelled to comment. So she left a comment. Her name is Hiba, apparently a young woman from Al Mahalla Kubra, and a graduate from Tanta University. So this is l'Égypte profonde as it gets. Let me translate part of what she wrote in Arabic. She says, "What has changed is us, a generation who saw experiences of other countries succeed, saw freedoms respected in other countries and denied in his own, a generation that saw the entire world through a mouse click and a technology available for all, a generation that didn't grow up on the myth of the ruler as father or as a divinity, and other nonsense that has been fed to us for 60 years, but saw President Clinton subject to trial in front of the whole world and just as a normal matter, a generation who gets news instantly, not through Channel 1 of the national TV, etc., etc." End of quote. This is the majority that overthrew Mubarak, then forced the military leadership to hand power to an elected president. And that was neither